Hi, I'm Carol Levin, as I think most of you know, the director of the Medieval and Renaissance Studies program here at the University of Nebraska. And I'm thrilled to see all of you here. I just wanted to mention that the last program in our series this semester is Thursday, December 2nd, when I will give a talk on a kind of a jazzy new research subject of mine, and it's called Incest, Poison, and Slander. We're going to have a really amazing and wonderful talk tonight. And I should say, before I ever met Catherine Loomis, I had read her absolutely amazing article on Elizabeth Southwell and her manuscript that she had, which Catherine had transcribed and published on what Southwell had to say about the death of Queen Elizabeth, which is quite outrageous, and I don't believe a word of it, but what Southwell said, not what Catherine transcribed. But it made me very excited when I got to meet Catherine a few years ago and find out that she is as lovely a person as she is as brilliant a scholar. Catherine Loomis is an associate professor of English and Women's Studies at the University of New Orleans, where she has taught, she claims, since the previous century. When she is not attending Mardi Gras parades and cheering on the saints, she teaches courses in Shakespeare, early modern drama and poetry, and Renaissance women writers. Her PhD is from the University of Rochester. Her MA is from the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon. So when she wasn't studying, she was watching plays. She has published a number of, as well as the Southwell article, which I just recently realized she published while still a graduate student. She has published a number of other really fine articles on the subject of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth. But what is most exciting to me is her new book, The Death of Queen Elizabeth, Remembering and Reconstructing the Virgin Queen, which was just published earlier this year by Palgrave Macmillan. Catherine is working also on a collection of poems and short prose pieces by early modern male authors who were pretending to be women, which sounds like a kind of literary cross-dressing exercise. Her talk tonight, Little Man, focuses on early modern perceptions of disability, looking specifically at Sir Robert Cecil, both statesman and dwarf. Catherine has told me that this talk includes every single thing she knows about Robert Cecil. So when we have our question period, she suggests you may want to ask her about some other things, and she thinks hurricane preparedness, exploding Renaissance corpses, men in verbal drag, or the saint's injury list would be good places to start. It is a great honor and a great pleasure for me to introduce Catherine Loomis.
Thank you. I know some of you here are graduate students, and when you go out and get your first job and start teaching and start going to conferences where you can actually afford to stay in a hotel, you'll get this delightful surprise, which is that you find out that your professors that you thought of as just, the people down the hall or whatever, are actually really famous. And Professor Levin is one of those, not only nationally but internationally esteemed and treasured by her colleagues, not only for her phenomenal scholarship, but also for her extraordinary generosity. And I thank you very, very much for letting me partake of that this trip. And thank you for inviting me. I'm going to start with a short quote from Hamlet. I have heard of your paintings well enough. God hath given you one face, and you make yourselves another. You jig and amble, you lisp, you nickname God's creatures, and make your wantonness your ignorance. Go to, I'll no more on it, it hath made me mad. Queen Elizabeth I may not have jigged, ambled, or lisped, as Shakespeare's Hamlet accuses all women of doing, but she certainly did nickname God's creatures. William Cecil, her wily Secretary of State, was her old fox. John Whitgift, the celibate Archbishop of Canterbury, was her black husband. Francis Walsingham, Secretary of State and collector of her intelligence, was Elizabeth's Moor. The exotic Robert Dudley, at least in public, was her gypsy. There is a scholar who insists that in private he was her flaming python of love, but we won't get into that. As this list indicates, Elizabeth's appellations for her courtiers were not always kind, and in at least one case we have an account of a recipient's negative reaction to receiving his royal nickname. In February of 1588, Robert Cecil, the son of William Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, accompanied an English commission visiting the Netherlands to negotiate with the Duke of Parma. At age 23, well-educated but largely sheltered from public life, Cecil had modest plans for the trip. This is a quotation from a letter. To see and hear something that may make me wiser and yield me the satisfaction that the being present at such a matter, however it may succeed, may afford my young years. As the arrival of the Spanish Armada a few months later demonstrated, the commission did not succeed, but Cecil made valuable contacts and also developed a lifelong aversion to warfare because of the horrors he witnessed firsthand as he traveled throughout the Low Countries. Having been identified as a likely successor to his father, Robert needed to convince others of his worth, and thus he was delighted to hear from Queen Elizabeth shortly after he sailed to the Netherlands. Well, sort of delighted. Writing to his father from Dover on February 16th, Cecil reports that, quote, he received from Her Majesty by Mr. Crofts a gracious message. Like Cecil's own mother, the Queen was worried about young Robert's precarious health, and she claimed to be, quote, looking to hear from him, right? She wanted to hear what he was up to. But unfortunately for Cecil, the letter was not addressed in a conventional style such as to young Master Cecil or to the Queen's right trusty and well-beloved servant. Instead, Elizabeth's letter was addressed to Cecil, quote, under her sporting name for me, Pygmy. In the 16th century, pygmies were thought to be dwarves originating in India or Ethiopia. Their most famous visual incarnation is in the representation of the classical battle between the cranes and the pygmies. Here are some dwarves often associated with digging and underground activities. Cecil, in his letter, sportingly goes on to report that he dares not write to the Queen himself because he is not considered a skilled enough correspondent. He worries that Elizabeth, quote, might conceive I thought it became me to presume to write unto herself, not being desirous of the office, because other must I write of nothing vainly, or else must I enter into that which is both subject here to suspicion and there to misconstruction. So very worried that she wouldn't take his letter kindly. Instead, Cecil cleverly adopts the strategy of writing to his cousin, John Stanhope, a courtier, who will be savvy enough to pass the letter on to the Queen. I have here written to my cousin Stanhope, as I know he will show Her Majesty wherein. He then concludes this thoughtful account of how best to communicate with the Queen with an uncharacteristically unguarded and poignant description of his reaction to being designated Her Majesty's pygmy. Quote, though I may not find fault with the name she gives me, yet seem I only not to mislike it because she gives it. It was interlaced with many fairer words than I am worthy of. Queen Elizabeth's choice of pygmy as a nickname, presumably inspired by Cecil's short stature, was a slight improvement over what the Venetian ambassador called him, a little hunchback, or what was once scrawled on his chamber door at Whitehall, Toad, or how contemporary epigram writers addressed him, Robin Crookback, monster of nature, the dissembling, smooth-faced dwarf, or what a modern biographer calls him, naturally pathetic, or what Cecil called himself, a cripple. During his life, and in the years immediately following his death, Cecil was compared to a camel, a spider, a dolphin, an ape, and punning on his name and his stature, a little bossy robin. James I's nickname for his most powerful court official seems a compliment in comparison. The king called Cecil his little beagle. And although these dogs are noted for their ability to dislodge troublesome badgers and for their fierce loyalty, Walter Raleigh may have had his enemy Cecil in mind when he used the word beagles to mean spies. quote, listeners in every corner of the realm. Nicknames for Cecil and his objections to them continued to accumulate. A July 1609 letter from Edward Somerset, the Earl of Worcester, notes, quote, "You take exception to be called fool," like who wouldn't? "And it will be mentioned, not only so, but a parrot monger, a monkey monger, and 20 other names, which, fearing the issue of future inconvenience of challenge, I will forbear to speak of anymore." I'm not even going to tell you the other things they're calling you. Anyone who has spent even a modest amount of time reading English Renaissance texts knows how unlikely it is that we will find anything like tolerance of physical difference. The poem called "The True Report of the Form and Shape of a Monstrous Child," which is your handout, the broadside handout, published the year before Cecil's birth, so this shows you what the thinking was the year he was born, is typical of the genre of grotesquely illustrated monstrous birth broadsides in which the bad behavior of the mother, or sometimes both parents, is blamed for the painfully described deformity of the infant. And I'm going to read just a little bit of the poem that you have on the broadside because it's in black letter type and it's not always easy to read that. "This monstrous world that monsters breeds, as rife as men tofore it bred by native kind, by births that show corrupted nature's strife, declares what sins beset the secret mind." So if you had a deformed body, it was because of a secret viciousness that was somehow now made visible. "I mean not this as though deformed shape were always linked with frauded mind with vice, sometimes there are exceptions, but that in nature God such drafts does shape, resembling sins that had been in price, that were like this. So grossest faults brazed out in body's form." So these are, this is the one that you have, but these are some other ones. These grossest faults, these terribly deformed, dog-faced fish people and people with ass's ears and so on. So these grossest faults brazed out in body's form and monster caused of want or too much store of matter shows the sea of sin. So again, this body is meant to reflect the sinfulness usually of the parents, whose storm overflows and whelms virtue's barren shore. And then at the end of the poem, "To show our miss, behold a guiltless babe reft of his limbs." So describing the infant who's shown in the picture at the top of the poem. "Himself and parents, both infamous made, with sinful birth, and yet a worldling scant." So here's a reason not to sin. It'll be taken out on your poor innocent children. "Fears midwives rout, bewraying his parents' fault," displaying his parents' fault in want of honesty and excess of sin. The poem's casual assumption that internal virtue and external beauty are linked, and that the sins of the parents or of the entire world are visited on the bodies of infants, shows the difficulty of Cecil's position as an official in a court whose success in a post-Reformation world depended in part on the skilled manipulation of visual images. In Cecil's case, the pejorative terms used to describe his body seem especially harsh, and that harshness implies that there was something very wrong with his shape. In early modern England, the theory of correspondence, a twisted body means a warped mind, would admit impediment to a pygmy, a dwarf, a cripple, anyone who was misshapen who wanted to pursue a public life. But the Cecil family had developed a habit of making themselves exceptions. Robert Cecil's deformities did not keep him from the court, did not reduce his services there to that of companion to Elizabeth's official court dwarf, Thomason, and were not blamed on his mother. Instead, this condition was consistently described as one he could not help. So unlike these pamphlets where in each case this deformity is described as something the mother did wrong, something she ate, something she looked at, sex she had outside of marriage, all kinds of reasons to blame. Here you see the mother actually has fallen into a pit after producing these 3 deformed children. And this one, they've actually given the conjoined twins a little rough there too as a decoration. The usual practice is to describe the mother, blame the mother for something she did, something she ate, something she looked at that caused her child's deformity. But the Cecils were careful to let it be known that Robert's deformities, a curved spine, splayed feet, a wry neck, a twisted neck, a disproportionately large head, and short height, were the result not of his mother, but of being dropped as an infant by a careless nurse. Okay, so, this is a more sympathetic, this is a continental picture, and you can see that here the deformed persons are actually clothed, unlike the English examples. This is the most fragile nurse I could find. She's from 1607, and she's in the Museum of Modern Art. So this nurse dropped him on his head and then didn't tell anyone she had done it, preventing any kind of timely medical intervention. However, a surviving description of Cecil's deformities by Theodore de Mayerne, a French physician who examined Cecil near the end of the secretary's life, indicates a serious set of physical impairments that was likely congenital, and there is some additional evidence for this. Robert Cecil's daughter, Frances, was also deformed, and before Cecil had even contemplated marriage, his father, William, had warned Robert that when seeking a wife, he should, quote, "make not choice of a dwarf or a fool, for from the one thou mayest beget a race of pygmies, the other may be thy daily disgrace." So they knew enough about genetics to know that, if he married a pygmy, then the chances the children would be that way would be strong. Blame for Robert Cecil's disability needed to be removed from Cecil's mother, Mildred Cook, for several reasons. The efforts of the Cecil family to rise above their humble origins would have been derailed had she, like other mothers on a lower rung of the social ladder, been found to be at fault for her child's deformities. Cook, whose husband lauded her on her Westminster Abbey funeral monument as far beyond the race of womankind, was exceptionally well educated and had been in charge of Robert Cecil's early education. Writing to his son after Mildred's death, William Cecil noted that it was she by whose tender and godly care thy infancy was governed, together with thy education under so zealous and excellent a tutor. She is not the kind of hapless or sinful woman usually presented in the monstrous birth pamphlets. Robert Cecil kept a portrait of his mother in his bedroom for his whole life, so if not snobbery, then perhaps affection kept him from blaming her for what she called his not strongest constitution. The family's efforts to shift the blame onto the hapless nurse shows an awareness of the vulnerability of women to the charge that they alone were responsible for a less than perfect infant, as well as the need to preserve Mildred's reputation. Whether or not Cecil's physical deformity originated like Richard III's in utero or was due to the nurse's carelessness, Cecil was frequently subjected to assumptions and accusations that his small stature, his curved spine, his unusual gait, and his weak shoulders were outward and visible signs of his inward corruption. When a posthumous epigram derided Cecil as not upright, it meant both his posture and his morals. John Mills, a servant of Cecil's enemy, the Earl of Essex, made the brutal claim that it was an unwholesome thing to meet a man in the morning who had a wry neck, a crooked back, or a splay foot, alluding by these speeches to Sir Robert. As the historian Pauline Croft notes in her comprehensive survey and analysis of the libels directed at Cecil after his death, the 17th century had little hesitation in equating physical imperfection with both moral and political decay. As Croft's meticulous reading demonstrates, the libels that make much of Cecil's deformity are linked to unhappiness with policies he instituted and are the verbal equivalent of those woodcuts that I showed you of the conjoined twins, the dog-faced babies, the other monsters whose existence is blamed on the sinfulness of wayward mothers. But we should also accept Francis Bacon's cautionary note in his essay on deformity as an indication that attitudes toward cripples were beginning to change. And this is Bacon writing. It is good to consider of deformity not as a sign, which is more deceivable, so stop thinking of it as a sign of what's going on inside the person, but as a cause, which seldom faileth of the effect. Whosoever hath anything fixed in his person that doth induce contempt, hath also a perpetual spur in himself to rescue and deliver himself from scorn. So now he's looking at it as kind of a motivation, right, rather than a sign. Bacon then argues that deformity is actually an advantage to a rising statesman. It makes him bold and industrious and apt to turn the faults of others into opportunities for retribution. The deformed are, quote, especially of this kind, to watch and observe the weakness of others, that they may have somewhat to repay. So it makes you very watchful, very aware of how other people's faults are maybe less visible than yours, but are still there. Deformity fools the able-bodied into complacent underestimation of the Cecils of the world, quote, laying their competitors and emulators asleep, as never believing they should be in possibility of advancement until they see them in possession. So you can fool everyone and then take over the world. That Bacon's Machiavellian statesman is prepared to take full advantage of his own deformity to advance in the world was understood by at least one of Cecil's contemporaries, the letter writer John Chamberlain, as a comment on Cecil himself. So Bacon writes this essay on deformity, just a generic essay, and people began immediately to apply it to Robert Cecil. Chamberlain wrote to Dudley Carleton, "Bacon paints out his little cousin to the life." Some other members of the world in which they were living, however, read Cecil's appearance differently. Rather than assuming Cecil exploited his deformity, for example, the Master of Grey, a Scots ambassador attempting to convince King James not to blame Robert Cecil for William Cecil's support of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, James's mother, argued that Cecil's persistence in the face of his physical struggles was a sign of extreme loyalty. I think if it were not for love and for obligation, he would never endure the excess trouble he hath presently. Nor almost is it possible for him to serve so ably, for although he has a very well composed mind, yet the ability of the body is so discrepant that it cannot correspond to the capacity of the mind. So it was a huge struggle for him to, come to work every day, and so this is a sign that he really had James's interests at heart. Similarly, Cecil's friend Thomas Sackville, the Earl of Dorset, in his will, praised Cecil lavishly for bearing, quote, "the heavy weight of so many grave and great affairs, which the special duty of his place as principal secretary doth daily and necessarily cast upon him," and noting, quote, "what infinite cares, crosses, labors, and travails of body and mind he doth continually sustain and undergo in order to provide painful service for the good of the public." Cecil's admirer, the playwright Cyril Turner, noted that Cecil functioned as a sort of living impresa, kind of icon for people to look at. He had a full mind in an imperfect body to tell a courtier the message that broadcast, that ornament is not his best part, or should not be. So Cecil was there to kind of remind people, don't worry about outward appearances. Cecil's ability to persevere despite pain, inconvenience, and ridicule was taken by some of his peers as a sign of his dedication, not as an effort to promote his own causes and career. Writing to the Doge in 1607, Niccolo Molan, the Venetian ambassador, described Cecil as short, crook-backed, but with a noble countenance and features. Indeed, in most of his portraits, that is exactly how he appears. He is frequently described by his contemporaries as handsome, and his hands are particularly characterized as graceful. And you'll notice in these portraits of him that his hands are often quite posed, so they're quite visible. Yet, even in portraits Cecil must himself have commissioned, his deformities are visible. And despite the family's careful efforts to keep Mildred Cook from blame, this is a copy of that same portrait, the two of them share a birthmark, which it's a little hard to see. It's right here. You see it on her as well. However, they're trying to free her from blame. They can't do it by saying that they don't look alike, because they certainly do. So they have this distinctive birthmark. Images of Cecil do not do away with his crooked back, although they sometimes pose him in ways that de-emphasize it. You'll notice this miniature is missing the birthmark for whatever reason. But he's put here at the end of the table so he can sort of turn and you don't see the big hump that he had. And again, his hands are posed to kind of emphasize their beauty and grace. There's a close-up of that so you see his shoulders, because of the way he's positioned, look fairly normal. Here you can see just slightly the raised shoulders, and if you didn't know about it, you might not even notice that. Here it's much more obvious, and these are getting obviously slightly later. And here it is quite easy to see as well. So he had sort of a good side for his profile pictures. Although historians still fail to agree on Cecil's reputation, skilled bureaucrat or bribe-taking self-server, those are the two camps, no one fails to note that he worked very hard. But given the emphasis on Cecil's physical deformity and even favorable accounts of him, his own description of his work habits, quote, "God knoweth I labor like a pack horse," seems fraught. He seems to be describing the crooked back. The image of a pack horse may be what James had in mind when he spoke to Cecil's older half-brother Thomas in April 1603 as the king stopped at Tybald's, the Cecil family estate, on his way to take the throne. I ought to let you know, Thomas wrote to his brother, a particular speech the king used toward you. Now, so here's the first time the king is talking about Robert Cecil. He said he heard you were but a little man, but he would shortly load your shoulders with business. So that pack horse idea seems to have caught on. While James was not particularly adept at diplomacy, verbal or otherwise, he owed his smooth accession to the English throne to Cecil's dedicated efforts. Writing to Cecil immediately after Elizabeth's death, the Earl of Montrose notes, "It has pleased God to bless the king with his due crown of England without shed of blood or trouble, to the great comfort of his whole people, and chiefly to your wisdom," right? Thanks to you. As most historians note, James at first attempted to minimize Cecil's role in the administration of his court, but quickly came to depend almost completely on his Secretary of State, a situation Roger Aston recognized when, in 1610, he compliments Cecil by noting, "The little beagle hath run a true and perfect scent, which brought the rest of the hounds to a perfect tune, which was before by their voices much divided," right? What a great way to hear that you did a good job. As Bacon suggests in On Deformity, Cecil was happy to exploit James's assumptions about those little shoulders and to make an emotional appeal to the king in an attempt to perhaps consolidate his power. Attempting to get James to consider peace negotiations with Spain, Cecil recounts a conversation he had with his father. "But son," said he, this is Cecil talking to James, reporting what his father said, "thou art young, and perhaps thy father's care and thy own good behavior may move thy prince to impose a part of that heavy weight which I have all my time carried upon thy weak shoulders, which if it happens upon my blessing, I charge thee that these 3 things you should have before your eyes. The first, tend in all thy actions to avoid foreign wars." Don't fight with Spain. "Next, labor with thy prince's honor to reconcile her to all enemies, so far as may stand with honor and safety. Thirdly, have regard to the tottering commonwealth after thy mistress' death, to invest the true and lawful successor." So Cecil is apparently just making all of this up, but he's using his body as a way to, kind of illustrate what he's saying. So he's deploying his body as a powerful visual aid in his efforts to persuade the king to avoid a costly war. In October 1606, Cecil uses a similar rhetorical maneuver in an apologetic letter to the king in which he exploits his short little body by describing his own abilities as, quote, "so short for the service of such a prince, and by characterizing his efforts to rein in James's spending as being undertaken by a man who, quote, "loves rather to speak too little, like myself, than too much in such cases," and identifying himself as a poor beagle and a sticking beagle who is subservient and loyal to his master. So Cecil was not above using his body, again, to try to convince James to do the right thing, or what he saw as the right thing. As Shakespeare notes of Richard III, a dramatic character the historian Pauline Croft and many other scholars link to Robert Cecil, a tardy cripple is not shaped for sportive tricks, a prejudice that, despite the triumphs of para-Olympians, is with us still. While female illnesses or deformity do not seem to have been an automatic barrier to reproduction, Catherine Minola, the protagonist of Taming of the Shrew, her suitors have many objections to her shrewishness, but no one seems to mind that she limps. Sick men are, as Shakespeare and many of his peers describe them, not just bedridden, but impotent and bedridden. As with Richard III, Cecil's aura of sexual inadequacy is false, but one of Cecil's modern biographers credits it with Cecil's success with Queen Elizabeth. Writing in 1914, Algernon Cecil, who's a descendant of Robert Cecil's, assuming that his audience will agree that Elizabeth showered handsome courtiers with favors she then withdrew, argues that Cecil's prospects were the more secure because they were utterly detached from his mistress's susceptibilities. In other words, saying, he was so ugly, she didn't bother with that, so she actually trusted him with genuine business. Francis Bacon, in his essay on deformity, concurs, "In their superiors, deformity quenches jealousy towards them as persons that they think they may at pleasure despise," right? So again, it's an advantage. Cecil appears to have become adept at using stereotypes and assumptions to lull to sleep his king, as well as his competitors and emulators. But their ignorance of or respect for his intelligence and power did not outweigh their need to emasculate him. When even Cecil's friends make note of his little crooked person, as Robert Naughton did in Fragmenta Regalia, a tribute to Cecil, one might expect his disabilities caused Cecil some anxiety when he considered marriage. Of course, that anxiety may have been exacerbated by the fact that his father advised him not to date dwarves. Although by the time Cecil married the maid of honor Elizabeth Brooke in 1589, he was used to the public nature of his life. As a court official, he recognized, quote, "All our actions are upon the open stage and can be no more hidden than the sun." He realized he would be subject to more intimate scrutiny in private. The night he met Elizabeth Brooke, he appears to have fallen truly, madly, deeply in love with her at first sight. The next day, Cecil wrote to his sister-in-law, Dorothy Latimer, describing this awkward situation, and seems fully and painfully aware that his affections will have to be governed by Brooke's reaction to his body, a very unusual situation for Renaissance men who usually had the upper hand in courtship. Quote, "The object to mine eye yesternight at supper hath taken so deep impression in my heart that every trifling thought increases my affection." So you all know that phase, right, when, love is blooming. "I know your inwardness with all parties to be such, as only it lieth in your power to draw from them whether the mislike of my person be such that it may not be qualified by other circumstances, like my position in court or my income. Which if it be so, as of likelihood it is, if she doesn't want me because of my body, and that's likely, I will then lay hand upon my mouth, though I cannot govern my heart, and saving my duty to God, exclaim on nature, which hath yielded me a personage to hinder me all other good fortune." Again, this is a very rare complaint from Cecil. Elizabeth Brooke, though, did not mislike Robert Cecil's person. She married him shortly after the death of his mother, and the marriage appears to have been a very happy one. When Brooke died after a miscarriage in 1597, Cecil was devastated at losing his, quote, "silent, true, and chaste wife." Those were the three big categories for good women, of course. And despite several opportunities, he refused to remarry, although Croft's analysis of the libels written after Cecil's death emphasizes that Cecil was frequently suspected of engaging in sexual intrigues, and there are all kinds of nasty poems about that. Cecil and Brooke had two children, a son, William, and a daughter, Frances. Frances was, as I mentioned earlier, like her father, deformed. In 1599, Cecil paid a physician £100, a huge amount of money, to straighten his daughter, who was then 6 years old. And when she married, her dowry was £6,000, which is about 3 times what the dowry of someone in her social class would normally be. A sum whose unusual size leads Pauline Croft to conclude that the straightening did not work, and so they had to up the dowry because her body was not quite right. Although she had 5 children, so she seems to have been okay in other ways. One of the few times Cecil complains in a letter about what must have been a constant fact of his social life is when he writes to a friend in London asking her to take particular care of Frances. Quote, "I know the fashion of the court and London is to laugh at all deformities. I would be exceeding glad that something was done to cover the poor girl's infirmities before such ladies and others who will find her out and who will see in what an ill case she is." Cecil's knowledge that the court and London greeted deformity with ridicule was surely hard won. And his plan to conceal his daughter's disability, he doesn't say whether it's by careful tailoring or locking her in a closet, provides further evidence of the enormous prejudices faced by deformed persons and the efforts Cecil felt he needed to make to spare his daughter from the gossip, humiliation, or damaged marriage prospects he himself had faced. By 1597, Cecil's court nickname had been upgraded to Little Man. And by 1601, having made himself indispensable to the elderly queen, Cecil was promoted to Elizabeth's elf. Cecil has left no record of whether he liked this name better than Pygmy, but in a joking letter to Elizabeth, in which he refers to the new moniker, elf, he does threaten to use his elvish eye beams to control her actions, which might be a sort of carefully worded vengeance against her. As the queen began to sicken in late 1602, and as she lay dying in 1603, however, she is again recorded as using Cecil's size and physical condition to remind him of his place, and perhaps to comfort herself with reminders of her own superior royalty. In the account of Elizabeth's death by Elizabeth Southwell, or as the Brits say, Elizabeth Southwell, a maid of honor who was in attendance on the queen in 1603, the dying queen rages at Cecil. Southwell's narrative has, until recently, been dismissed as an improbable fiction, in large part because she was Catholic and because in 1605, just like in a Shakespeare play, she disguised herself as a boy and ran away to Italy with her married lover, Robert Dudley. Because Southwell's manuscript casts Robert Cecil in a very poor light, the secretary may himself have contributed to the suppression of some of the more unusual details Southwell reports. But in 1607, while living in Florence, Southwell was visited by the Jesuit Robert Parsons, to whom she gave her account of Elizabeth's final days, and Parsons published an edited version of events in a pro-Catholic book. Southwell's narrative deeply implicates Robert Cecil in the unhappy and at times diabolical events surrounding the Queen's death. The narrative begins when Cecil's familiar, which is a word used for the creature that assists a witch, Cecil's familiar, John Stanhope, gives the Queen a talisman to wear to extend her life, a gold coin strangely marked. Instead, as soon as Queen Elizabeth puts it on, she begins to sicken. So it's as though that kind of caused this whole thing. Later, when the Privy Council gathers around Elizabeth's bed to ask her to name a successor, an event documented by several contemporary sources, Southwell claims that the Queen did not name James, but instead that Cecil and the Council of their own accord went forth and reported she meant the King of Scots. After the Queen's death, Southwell insists that Cecil ignored Elizabeth's order that her corpse not be opened in preparation for burial. Of all the details unique to Southwell's manuscript, though, only one has made it into the standard histories of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and that is Elizabeth's castigation of Cecil. So it's the modern historians are participating in this as well. According to Southwell's account, after several days of refusing to go to bed, Elizabeth was approached by the Earl of Nottingham, Charles Howard, her Lord Admiral. Southwell reports, "For any of the rest, she would not answer them any question, but said softly to my Lord Admiral's earnest persuasions that if he knew what she had seen in her bed, he would not persuade her as he did." So she was seeing visions of fiery visions of something in her bed. And she said, if you knew what I saw, you wouldn't try to make me go to bed. And Secretary Cecil, overhearing her, asked if Her Majesty had seen any spirits, any ghosts, to which she said she scorned to answer him to so idle a question. Then he told her how to content the people Her Majesty must go to bed, to which she smiled, wonderfully condemning him, saying that the word must was not to be used to princes. Thereupon said, little man, if your father had lived, you durst not have said so much. But thou knowest I must die, and that maketh thee so presumptuous." So this is the only section of the manuscript that is quoted in modern histories of the Queen's final days. There are much more interesting details in the Southwell manuscript. She reports, for instance, that the Queen's corpse exploded and burst out of its coffin during the wake, for example. But the little man story is the one that modern historians consider worth including in their accounts of the end of her reign. For those with royalist sympathies, the little man designation is a reminder that the Cecils of the world may be desertful statists, as one of his fans calls him, but that goose-quilled gentlemen, which one of his enemies calls him, are not the larger-than-life figures that monarchs are meant to be. They're little. For anti-royalists, the Queen's final comments to her secretary show her as cruel and ungrateful. They are also a reminder of the ways in which Elizabeth and her court emasculated Cecil in an effort to control him. Cecil was part of Elizabeth's magnificent funeral procession, and two images of him marching survive. This is a bit of the procession. This isn't Cecil yet, just to show some of its magnificence. There were flags and music. You see the trumpets up here in the front, and various other objects being carried as signs of Elizabeth's royalty. This is Elizabeth's hearse. This is an effigy of her, surrounded by all of these flags. She was wearing her Parliament robes for this last trip that she took. So the first image that I want to show you of Cecil, there's a little close-up of the, is a pen and ink drawing. And Cecil is right here, okay, the principal secretary. What do you notice about him? He's about the same size as the other people, right? And they all look alike. It's like there's just kind of one face. So this, this may have been a drawing that was made ahead of time. The list of who was going to be in the procession was released way before the funeral, so the artist may have, just kind of gotten things set up. So this is the first one. This one is, we know, by William Camden. There's a second image, and that's the one on your handout, and this is preserved in an anthology of watercolors of royal and aristocratic funerals. So the watercolors from several funerals are bound together in a huge, huge volume at the British Library. Elizabeth's funeral procession occupies several folios of this because it was a big, huge, long procession. And again, the order of the marchers was known ahead of the funeral. The artist appears to have drawn and painted the figures before the procession took place, perhaps adding details like hair color or a handkerchief. The Marchioness of Northampton has the most spectacular handkerchief you ever saw. Cecil's figure, as it is in the William Camden drawing, this one that's up here, is initially drawn as a full-size adult. And you can see that if you look carefully at the handout, you can see the outline. And you can see, I'm sorry, it's harder to see here. This is where that is, where the top of it is. So you see he's the same height as everyone around him initially. That image was then scraped out of the drawing, and it was replaced by this tiny hunchback figure. Unfortunately, what we don't know is why that happened, and that is at the moment impossible to determine. It could be that the artist, having done this all ahead of time, went to the procession and said, oh, I forgot the hunchback. Okay, that's certainly a possibility. It could be that Cecil himself insisted on it, knowing that his enemies would use that against him, saying, look what Lord Robert is doing, or Sir Robert at that time, to kind of make himself look more important. It could have been Cecil's enemies who said, put the hunchback back in. We don't know. It could be that the College of Arms, who commissioned this, wanted an accurate record of the Queen's funeral. There is another figure quite near Cecil, right about here, that's also been scraped out, but his height hasn't changed. So it could be that there was there were ways that one could look at one's portrait here and comment on it and have it changed. So compared to the formal portraits of Cecil, the ones I showed you earlier, that this is absolutely brutal, right? This picture of him, you can see he's got a huge hump, right? That's not visible in the other pictures, and then with the difference in the height being quite noticeable. So compared to the formal portraits of Cecil, the watercolor is brutal in its depiction of him as a little crookback. Yet it was made at a time when Cecil's power was at its absolute peak as the new king was coming in. While the likeness may be a good one, the impression that it leaves is of a court official who is, in truth, sometime less than a man. Thanks in part to Cecil's efforts, James succeeded to the English throne easily and peacefully. But the process of making this happen seems to have exhausted Cecil. By May 1603, when the king stopped at Tybalt's for some hunting, intending to get to London soon to be crowned, Cecil wrote a letter describing the revulsion he felt at the crowds that had gathered around James. This letter acknowledges the disadvantages he faced when compared to other better able men. Too much crowding, Cecil wrote, doth not well for a cripple. And the king doth find scant room to sit himself. He hath so many friends, as they choose to be called, and heaven prove they not lie in the end. Although James would eventually restore Cecil's power and give him more of it and grant him increasingly grand titles, Cecil seems to have been less happy in the new court. The May 1603 letter, which is to his cousin John Harrington, is usually noted only because in it, Cecil characterizes Elizabeth as, quote, more than a man and in troth sometime less than a woman. And it concludes with Cecil wishing that, quote, he, quote, waited now in Elizabeth's presence chamber with ease at my food and rest at my bed. I am pushed from the shore of comfort and know not where the wind and waves of a court will bear me. After serving James for nearly a decade and preventing the king from bankrupting England, Cecil died of scurvy, a disease whose horrifying symptoms include huge open sores and terrible bad breath, symptoms that Cecil's enemies exploited mercilessly in the scurrilous epigrams that followed the secretary's death. Accusing Cecil of having contracted syphilis from one or both of his purported mistresses, Lady Walsingham and Lady Suffolk, the epigram writers, as well as the Earl of Northampton, used these additional physical defects of the symptoms of scurvy to accuse Cecil of malfeasance and corruption, right? All of his corruption is now coming out in these great big open sores and his bad breath. Pauline Croft, again in that wonderful analysis of these verbal attacks, shows that the images of Cecil that these poems present is exceptionally vicious, even by 17th century satirical standards. He is reduced to a lascivious cripple in 2 lines. Here lies Robert Cecil, composed of back and pissel, pissel being a slang term for penis. He is feminized as a heart-gripping harpy. He is derided because he has at last left his plotting and is now a rotting. The Earl of Northampton imagines the little lord in hell kneeling in front of Elizabeth, quote, by an extreme hot fireside. Even his friends cannot quite manage to praise him once he's dead. The playwright Cyril Turner, a beneficiary of Cecil's patronage, remarks in a tribute to the secretary that Cecil was not bad looking, provided you saw him sitting in a chair. Turner defends Cecil's career by arguing that nature had deliberately crippled him to keep him from pursuing an active life because God is an Englishman. This was to England's great benefit. Cecil's monument in a chapel at Hatfield House provides a shocking reminder of the frailty, not just of his flesh, but of all flesh. At the top, it looks quite conventional, but underneath is his skeleton. Okay. This is a not uncommon device in early modern tombs, but it was way less fashionable in 1612 than it had been earlier. Neither the figure on the top nor the skeleton beneath appears to be crooked, and neither one is shaped like a dolphin, but the overall effect is not one of vanity or excessive pride in his political accomplishments or his appearance. Among Cecil's contemporaries were some who suspected that the dwarves and cripples found on the early modern stage were meant to be portraits of the secretary. Samuel Daniel's Craterus from his play Philotas and Damitas from John Day's Isle of Gulls are generally agreed by most scholars to be satirical portraits of Cecil. John Day in the Isle of Gulls first claims no court figures are represented in this play, right? It is not based on a true story. Then he has a character describe Damitas, the cripple, using the vocabulary specifically associated with Cecil. The dwarf expresses to the life the monstrous and deformed shape of vice. And he is called not the court beagle, but the court spaniel, right? No, I don't mean him, I mean the spaniel, right? Ben Jonson's friendship with Cecil is usually offered as a reason not to read Volpone's Nonno as a dwarf à clef, but Jonson did tell William Drummond that Cecil never cared for any man longer than he could make use of him, so perhaps he was getting a kind of literary vengeance. The exploits of the lame Lieutenant Stump of the anonymous Alarum for London, or the pleasant humors of the cripple of Fanchurch from the Maid of the Fair, or the Fair Maid of the Exchange, are generally not understood as referring to Cecil, but it is difficult to think of a court performance in which any limping character might not, at least briefly, be understood as representing Cecil. While Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew does make extensive reference to Cecil's favorite form of recreation, hawking, it is unlikely that the world doth report that Kate doth limp because she's meant to be a cleverly disguised Cecil being whipped into shape by an even more cleverly disguised Queen Petruchio. But a survey of the responses to Cecil's body, the scorn with which he was greeted, the efforts he and his family made to rise above the equation of physical and moral deformity, the inescapability of his condition, provide us with a more detailed account of life as a cripple than we are able to find in other sources, literary or not. Some literary sources, particularly those by Shakespeare, do offer a glimpse of that life. Sonnet 37's announcement that the narrator is, quote, made lame by fortune's dearest spite, a sentiment repeated in Sonnet 66's lament that the narrator must behold strength by limping sway disabled. And there's a suggestion in Sonnet 129 that the dark lady has syphilis, which by Sonnet 144 she has given to the narrator and to the fair young man. These references may, if you accept the sonnets as biographical, offer support for the case that Shakespeare was lame, either by birth, accident, or by contracting syphilis. Additional evidence for Shakespeare's lameness includes a theatrical anecdote associating him with only 2 roles in his canon. The first is the elderly Adam of As You Like It, who is really old, he's 80, and the stalking ghost in Hamlet. Neither role requires the sort of stamina and acrobatics that other parts demanded. So if Shakespeare were indeed infected with syphilis at the time the sonnets were composed, as more and more scholars are beginning to accept, his death in 1616 at age 52 would be timed just right for the arrival of the fatal 3rd stage of that disease. Infection with syphilis would also go a very long way toward explaining Shakespeare's obsession with the disease and its symptoms including its ability to make you lame, in his problem comedies, the comedies of the turn of the century, from about 1603 to 1605. The rage that Cecil must have felt and successfully suppressed in public is the same sort of rage that is given a local habitation and a name by Shakespeare when he creates characters like the, quote, deformed and scurrilous Thersites in Troilus and Cressida, Tom of Bedlam in King Lear, who is Edgar in disguise, and the savage and deformed slave Caliban from The Tempest, characters whose deformities, consciously adopted or not, keep them permanently separated from the rest of humanity, give them license to rail bitterly against life's inequities, and force the audience to ask where exactly to draw the line between human and monstrous, between normal and deformed. Like Cecil, these dramatic characters do a lot of necessary, thankless work. And like him, they are great observers of how power is acquired and how it is exploited. Whether or not Shakespeare was thinking of a man like Cecil when he created these parts, or was writing about a situation he himself knew all too well, or was just letting his imagination body forth the forms of things unknown, as poets are allowed to do, the presence of these characters, like Cecil's in the court, reminded his audience, and reminds us, that when you are straight enough in the shoulders, you care not who sees your back. Although Shakespeare gives that line to his fat knight, Sir John Falstaff, it applies equally well to Robert Cecil, the man whose monarchs labeled him a pygmy and a beagle, but who described himself as one that has sorrowed in the bright luster of a court and gone heavily, even on the best seeming fair ground. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions? Rendered speechless, oh no.
I'll start.
Okay.
When did Bacon write his on deformity? And everyone, you said everyone sort of assumed it was about Robert Cecil.
We don't know when he wrote it, but it first appeared in 1601 in the 1601 edition of the
Bacon
essays.
ever say or express anything that it was indeed about?
Bacon himself did not, no, but Chamberlain is generally considered a reliable source of what people were thinking, what people affiliated with the court were thinking. So, but no, not Bacon himself. So. Idle speculation, as usual, from me. So.
I was really struck by the interesting paradox that you trace in terms of visibility.
Yes.
That that Cecil saw himself as under all of his actions under the bright sun. That there's nothing hidden, and he's certainly applying that to the whole court. But his visual appearance is clearly a major focus for people. But then in Bacon's essays and other places, it actually functions as a disguise.
Right.
That he's serving as the thing that's hidden by being so out in the open.
Right. Exactly.
And I don't particularly have a question about this. I was just your kind of ending comments really struck me in terms of the way in which the obvious physicality is functioning to hide something.
Right. And whether what's hidden is what Bacon implies. Bacon was quite jealous of Cecil's success in the court. So Bacon is implying, he's bamboozled all of them, and he's a thief in disguise, and they don't suspect him because what can a dwarf do? Where Cecil's claim would be that he was disguising a lot of pain, right? And there was hidden virtue at work. So, please ask some other questions.
Can you talk a bit about your own sense of the argument that Shakespeare's Richard III has some function of commenting on Cecil?
Right.
Made that case. What do you
this is a really tricky question because Shakespeare dedicated his two long poems to the Earl of Southampton, who may be the fair young man of the sonnets. There's still endless debate about that. And of course, the fair young man of the sonnets could be a complete fiction, but Shakespeare had some kind of relationship with Southampton. Southampton was part of the Essex faction, and Cecil was on the other side of the Essex faction. So Shakespeare was using his history plays in various very clever ways. For instance, the night before the Essex Rebellion, the rebels asked his acting company to put on Richard II, right, to kind of rev everybody up for the big deposition. So there are clearly connections with those history plays and contemporary historical events, although safely distanced enough so that the censors didn't stop them from being performed. So then when you take something like Richard III, yes, you can't look at this crippled figure and not think, something's rotten at the core of our court. But that part was played by Richard Burbage, who was sex on wheels. And we have an anecdote from John Manningham's diary that a woman, a citizen of London, respectable woman, went to see Richard III and then sent a note backstage asking him to come to her in costume. So there was this, hugely sexy appeal somehow with this. And if you've ever seen it on stage, you know that it has to operate that way, right? Or otherwise the Lady Anne part makes no sense at all. Okay, so Shakespeare intercepts the note, goes down to where the woman is staying, has his way with her, right? And then Burbage shows up, knock, in costume, struggling along there. Sends up to the lady, I'm here, and Shakespeare writes a note back down. William the Conqueror was before Richard III. So as a roundabout way of answering that question, yes, I think Shakespeare probably was being as topical as he ever is, which is, kind of giving him plausible deniability. If the censors said, you cannot put this on stage, and he could say, well, it's historical.
But also the way Richard inveighs against the Woodvilles.
Yes,
would be the equivalent of the way many people in the aristocracy would feel about the Cecils.
Absolutely, right, the upstarts, and so of course that again gives you that kind of deniability, why would I put those words in his mouth? But right, if you wanted to, sort of associate people with crooked backs with crooked activities, no more effective way to do it than to put that play on. So. Yes?
I thought it was kind of curious how the way you described it seemed like he got on a little better with James than he did with Elizabeth. And Elizabeth had so much in common with him in terms of having to justify her position despite being a woman.
Right, despite having a body that wasn't acceptable somehow. Right.
About their bodies and try to. So it's just kind of odd to me, I guess.
Yeah.
You think that they'd be really good friends, and yet they.
Well, Elizabeth had a very. James is considered by most professional historians to be the laziest king England ever had on the throne, right? So when he found out what Cecil could do for him, he was just like, take over, that's fine. And, keeps calling him these nicknames because he thinks it's going to make Cecil like him more or something. Elizabeth was a snob. Excuse me. And although she appreciated the competence of the Cecils, she was never going to be friends with them because they were not of royal blood. So they couldn't, they were very, very close in ways that I have not made clear here, but right. James didn't kind of follow that same strict rule of, you're not royal, I can't call you my little beagle and pet you and things. So. Other questions? Yes.
This is along the lines of exploding corpses and Saints injury list, but I was really struck by a detail that I have to take the opportunity to ask you about. So Elizabeth's nickname for Walsingham was the Moor?
Yes.
Why was that?
We think because he was quite dark hair and dark eyes, but also because he was, the adjective dark was used to mean secret in a way that we don't use it. So, for instance, in the Southwell manuscript, a different account of Elizabeth's final moments, when she says, when they say, who do you want to be king? And she says, I'll have no rascal in my seat. And then the counselors say to her, we don't understand this dark matter you have just discussed. So it's reflective of the racial prejudices of the age, meaning he's involved in dark matters, so I will call him something dark. But it may also have had to do with his coloring, as apparently was the case with the gypsy designation for Robert Dudley. So, although that may have had to do with his fine dancing as well. We wish we knew.
Doesn't it, with Walsingham, the fact that he's her spy master?
Yes, oh, absolutely,
so it
yeah.
really ties in with all of it.
Right, with the sense, that he's involved in the dark arts, not in the Harry Potter sense, but in the sense of, right, investigating things secretly. Yes.
Speaking of dancing, did either Cecil or certainly Robert, did they ever take part in court?
I have not found anything about Robert. There is a reference to Frances dancing, so she was straightened enough to bear children and to participate in dances, but no, as far as I know, Cecil was unable. I mean, it doesn't sound as if he would have been physically able to do that, and of course,
Well, one
No.
doesn't.
well, he wouldn't have had a suitable partner in the court, really. So, we do know though that Cecil used to wear a portrait of Elizabeth, and people would make jokes about that. You know, is that your girlfriend? Kind of jokes. So it's as if he tried to find a way in that complex vocabulary of courtly love, in the Elizabethan sense, to woo the queen, but he couldn't do it through dancing. So. Other questions? Yes.
Was his daughter born less straight, like less crooked, or was it that the doctor actually had a effect on her?
We honestly don't know that. The man who put her into what were called the instruments, which Professor Levin can tell you a little more about, claims to have cured her and collected his £100 for doing so. But the huge dowry means that something, that it didn't take all the way, or maybe she was just extremely short. We don't know. Unfortunately, there's not a portrait of her that I've been able to find, although there may be one in Peterborough Cathedral in the basement somewhere. I don't know. Other questions?
Would that height have been as much an issue for a woman as for a man?
Mm-mm. We know from skeletal evidence that women were a lot hugely smaller than men in that period, so no. And Queen Elizabeth's dwarf, the official court dwarf, was a woman, a female dwarf as well. So. Plus she imported another one from Russia at one point. So, anything else? Yes?
Would poverty from illness or anything like that affect the women of the court?
Well, the one exception to the rule seems to have been smallpox, because we know that people who had smallpox, who had prominent positions, kept them after recovering. And it's odd, no one comments on it. There must have been, smallpox leaves hideous scars, right? Just unbelievable scars. And there must have been plenty of people who had them, but it never shows up in portraits and it's never mentioned. So it could just be one of these things that we simply do not talk about because, there's nothing that anyone could have done, and it affected a lot of people. We know, for instance, Sir Philip Sidney's mother nursed Queen Elizabeth through smallpox. Elizabeth had a very mild case, but Mary Sidney had a severe case and was so deformed that she was veiled for the rest of her life and would never let anyone see her face ever again. So, so smallpox it's like the unmentionable sort of thing. Yeah, Shakespeare makes fun of one. In fact, Mistress Overdone. She's had 8 husbands, overdone by the 9th. And she has, her hip bones are gone, and she walks with a terrible limp, and at her brothel, many of the other characters on stage have become infected with syphilis. So the thing about syphilis was the primary symptoms would go away in the same amount of time it took for the quack cure to work. So it looked like you were cured, right, in terms of cause and effect. The quack cure was to put you in a tub and pour mercury in and let you inhale the fumes. This would make your hair fall out and your teeth fall out. But at the end of 6 weeks of treatment, you looked like you were cured. The sores were gone. Well, that's because the sores go away in 6 weeks no matter what you do, right? But people were just like not seeing this. So then it would go away and then it would come back like 18 years later. And terrible things would happen to you. Your nose would fall off, your soft palate would collapse, your bones would, they called it having hollow bones. You have this terrible, unbelievable, persistent ache in your bones and you limped. There was no way you could hide that. Although people tried and tried and tried to find ways to hide it, they could not. So Shakespeare refers to syphilis a lot, and one of the places where he does it is in Hamlet when Claudius says, I'm like the owner of a foul disease. I won't go to the doctor to cure it because I don't want anyone to know I have it, right? So that seems to have been the habit with syphilis, that people would sort of pretend they didn't have it and go hide. And it does not sound as if Cecil did have it. Medical historians who've looked at the very detailed account that Theodore de Mayerne gives of Cecil's illness say it is definitely scurvy, so, and cancer as well. He had huge, huge tumors. So. And he died an absolutely miserable, god-awful death, which his enemies were delighted to hear, unfortunately. Other questions? All right, thank you very much for coming out on a Thursday night.